so you never really know when it starts. But looks like it started now. So Hala, we're live. Like I said, I haven't even told you what we're doing, but now I guess I'll tell you. So trending up is this podcast I started recently, where I interview CEOs and CMOs and try to figure out like how they went from 0 to 1, and
Okay.
then from like 1 to 10, how they grew their business, and in this case, how they grew their podcast. So
Okay.
so I don't know that I'd slap the CMO or CEO title on you. You're just my friend who's growing an awesome podcast. So like that's what I want to talk about
Cool.
today. Like what were your like initial expectations with Young and Profiting, which by the way people can find on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify. It's a good podcast. I've been a guest.
Yeah.
Robert Greene's been a guest.
hmm
Yeah, a lot of good people on there.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for inviting me on to
Hmm.
this new series. It sounds like a really awesome show, so congratulations.
Thanks.
In terms of my initial expectations for Young and Profiting podcast, really, I didn't have expectations for like certain numbers of downloads and
Hmm.
I didn't know that I was going to become like a top 10 self improvement podcast. My main goal was to help people. And so I really just wanted an opportunity to speak to others and gain insight from people who are much smarter than me on a certain topic and understand what they're all about, what that topic is all about,
Right.
and then relay that information to my listeners. And so I really had two main goals. That was for me to continually learn, and I used it as a platform for myself so I could learn. And then the second part was to then like distribute that information. And so that was really my main goal. I didn't have like monetization goals or
Hmm.
download goals. It was purely like passion and a hobby that I was really interested in. And I think that's why it was successful because I actually cared about what I was doing and it wasn't like, oh, I just want to be a top podcast. It was like I want to
Right.
learn and I want people to learn and this is my opportunity.
You had that guaranteed audience of one, as Tim Ferriss would say. Like, I don't think that, the average person, you and I included, should start a podcast if they don't have that guaranteed audience of one. So when
hmm
you realize you have more than an audience of one, like what do you think did that? What are some of the elements that played into gaining more listeners over time? And
Yeah.
when did you notice like big changes?
Yeah. So the first initial like 3 months of my podcast, I wasn't getting that many downloads. I would get like 250 downloads per episode. And it
Mm-hmm.
was mostly like I was still I was like very closely aligned with like my alumni network at school. And it was like a lot of people who were from my school, family, friends, and so on. And then I started to scale a little bit faster. So in the beginning, I was only putting out about one episode per month. And then,
Yeah, wow. I
yeah,
remember
yeah,
that.
and then I got a team, and then I started putting out like one per week, and that's when it really started to scale. And that's also when I started to really push and be more proactive with my listeners. So I started DMing all my followers and giving them like direct links to the podcast, asking them to listen. And so I essentially grew my listenership like on a one by one basis. And so I would
Mm,
like message people and tell them about the podcast and then they would become fans and then they would post about it. And because it was still like really small, people were really into like sharing it and posting it because it was very good content and like
mhm,
not a lot of people knew about it. So they felt like they found like a secret and they wanted to share it with all their friends, right?
mhm.
So it was really proactive and it was really manual. Eventually, I moved on to like different tools, like automation tools, so that every time somebody followed me, they'd automatically get a message, things like that, which I think are really good tactics to use if you have a podcast. And then, of course, like social media posts. So LinkedIn has a great organic reach. And so I really take pride and I have a lot of experience with social media. And so creating unique graphics that really stand out on LinkedIn, creating great
And
captions that capture attention. Yeah.
yeah, like you're probably not like the graphic expert either. I mean, you delegate that to people who are like way better at it. Is that the case?
No, actually,
Oh,
I have a lot of graphic design
oh wow.
background and video editing.
We've been friends for a little bit, and I actually didn't know that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I typically actually create the templates for my team
Oh
and then they
wow.
replicate it. Yeah, so
I
that's
had no
usually what I
clue.
do. Yeah, I
Wow.
think that's actually why I get away with like doing stuff so much like on the fly. I just have an idea and I have the skills to just do it in terms of what I want an image to look like or what I want a video to look like. And that's great because I also have the skills to recruit it like interns and they're happy to kind of work for free because I'm teaching them all these skills and giving them access to all this software and stuff.
Well, what are these messages that you're sending out to people on a one-to-one basis? Like, what do those sound like?
Yeah, so there's two parts. So right now, I get a lot of followers. If you go on my LinkedIn right now and you check, I have like 500 people who want to follow me that I still have to like
Mm-hmm.
review. But previously, it was more proactive where I would invite people to connect. And so
Same.
there it was two parts. So if a post went viral, there was a lot of people like second connections that wouldn't ask me to connect. They would just like and comment on my post when they were second connections. So one part of my strategy was anybody who liked any of my posts that was a second or third connection, I would proactively invite them to connect, and I'd be like, "Hey, what's going on? I noticed you liked my content. I would love to connect and provide value on your feed." That was one part of my strategy to get new followers that I could then further message and give them more information about my podcast. The other strategy that I used is going on somebody like Gary Vee or Tony Robbins or somebody who's in the self improvement space that has a lot more followers than me, looking at their posts, seeing who liked and commented on their posts, and inviting those people to connect. And the message was slightly different. It would be me saying something like, "Hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
I have a podcast. I think if you're interested in Gary Vee's content, you'll probably be interested in mine too." Right?
Yeah,
So then,
and that's something I feel like you really that's one of your big things. Like I learned that from you, and you do this like you comment on something very thoughtful on like Gary Vaynerchuk's post,
yeah.
and you're like oftentimes the top comment on that post, and you just create a community of like people who are already interested in the type of things that you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, and so by doing that strategy, like Jordan just mentioned, by following a lot of people who follow Gary Vee, I ended up get people would notice my content because that's how the algorithm works. Sorry, notice my comment is what I meant to say. That's how the algorithm works. So I'd get like
And plus
100
your
likes.
content.
Yeah, and then I get like 100 likes on that comment, and then it would even go further where people would proactively ask me to connect. So it would go both ways. Like I would ask people to connect who didn't ask me, and they would ask me because they saw me on Gary Vee's post. Anyway, long story short, I'm getting all these new followers because of me being proactive, people seeing me more, being visible on stuff like Gary Vee's post, and then I would send a second follow up message. So once they actually in, accepted my invite, then I would say, "Hey, thanks for the invite. Happy to have you on my network. I have a self improvement podcast. We focus on productivity, time management, how to how to have a side hustle. If you like this kind of content, check out my podcast. Here are all the links to all the platforms. And if you really enjoyed the show, please leave an Apple Podcast review." And then I would say that one of my main goals is to get as many Apple Podcast reviews as possible. And so that's usually my third message. So if somebody comes back and says, "I love the show. It was so awesome. I learned so much," I would say, "Awesome. We do this for you guys. The best way to thank us is with an Apple Podcast review." And then hopefully they give me a review. And that's really the full message drip.
And what has been your strategy? I know I kind of like know the answer, at least for me, because I've had big guests on my podcast, obviously. But how have you gone about like getting big guests on your podcast? Because I think from the beginning, like you didn't really have too much of a, like a takeoff. Like you were already just like off and
Yeah.
running. It seemed like you were just getting really credible people right out of the gate.
Yeah, so I think that really has to do with my past experiences. And so previous to this, I used to own a blog and it was an entertainment news website. I had like 50 female bloggers under me. And so I had like a decent following on Twitter, which really nobody really, at least people my age and like we don't really use Twitter anymore. So it was like kind of
Yeah.
didn't matter anymore, but I had a story. And so that was really important. And so my first episode, I reached out to two best-selling authors, Dr. Jack Schaefer of The Like Switch, Dory Clark, who wrote Stand Out. and I wanted to do an episode on first impressions. And so I told them about
Oh,
this
Dory
idea.
Clark was in that episode. I
Yeah.
didn't know you'd recommended her to me as a guest, and I listened to that episode a long time ago. Never just okay, I got it
Yeah,
now.
so she was in that episode. And
Cool.
she's great. And so I actually wrote them both separate emails, and I probably solicited a lot of people. Maybe I reached out to 20 people,
Mm.
but those were the two that accepted. And I wrote them an email and I
Only
told them,
two?
maybe not. I don't remember exactly, but like I reached out to like a bunch of people and those two people accepted. And originally my format was much different. I wanted to interview like 2 to 5 people on each podcast and I would like chop up all the audio and I had narration. It was like way harder to do. Now I just do like one-on-one interviews and it's just as good, but it scales much better. And anyway, so I invited a whole bunch of people who were like experts on first impressions. Those two people had accepted. And I think the reason why I got such high caliber guests is because I had a story. And so I told them like, this is my first podcast, but I had about 4 online radio shows before this. And I told them I used to work at Hot
Right.
97, a radio show. I used to have a blog site that was very popular. I used to interview celebrities. So it was positioning it as like, hey, this is my first podcast, but it's not my first rodeo. I think it's going to be successful. Like, take a chance on me. What do you think? And both of them said yes, and it turned out to be great. And now I've brought it full circle where I've brought them different opportunities. For example, I had Jordan Harbinger on my show, who's like a number one podcaster in the world, and I ended up introducing him to Jack Schaefer, and now Jack Schaefer is going to be on his show. And so it's like he
Nice.
did me a favor, and then I was like, listen, I'm going to hook you up with the top podcaster in the world.
Nice.
Yeah.
And what separates you, Hala, from like, the other people on LinkedIn who have a podcast who are posting about it and, maybe getting 3 likes per post and they're just not seeing the results?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's that proactive following strategy that I have.
Yeah.
If you have a community of 2,000 people and they're people that you barely know or people that aren't interested in your content, you're not going to get a lot of engagement. So I think I've purposely curated a following that is interested in my content by those strategies that I talked about previously. So I think that's number one. Number two is that my content stands out. I have really bright colors, I have
You do.
animations, I have a really solid brand, everything is consistent. My captions are A+ quality. Like, that's one of my best talents is copywriting, and so that's super important. And now I'm breaking out into video and doing different things. And so I think that I just have I'm kind of like always like a step ahead of everybody else. So like I feel like I was one of the first people to start doing audiograms. Then everybody started doing audiograms that look the same. Then I changed mine to make them look different.
They are getting a little stale too. I still put
Yeah.
them out, but they're getting a little
They're
stale.
getting stale, and like
Yeah.
I've stopped putting them out so much. Now I'm doing like live stream videos with like a custom background, and I feel like that's kind of like newish. There's some people doing it, but not many people are doing it, and so like I just try to stay ahead of the curve. And then I think the last thing is like really engaging in your comments. That's something that people often neglect to do. So like even when I was getting like if you scroll back even just last year when I wasn't getting that many like or let's say like a year and a half ago when I wasn't getting that much engagement, I was commenting on everybody's comments. So
Right.
I'd reply back and I would kind of like sow the seeds of my community and not just like let them hang dry so that next time I post something they respond and they remember like, oh yeah, Hala actually engages with me and I get a reward for commenting.
So somebody here live watching, Kelvin Murray, he says, with having so many followers in your network, does it get overwhelming to connect with people who, you might feel that you can build a strong relationship with them, but like, I think what he's saying, does it just get to be like too much? Do you get tired of it? Like, you know what I mean?
Like to have like build like the yeah, it gets harder and harder as
To
you have
scale those
more
relationships.
followers. Yeah, it gets harder and harder and you've got to be a little bit more strategic about who you want to spend the time on in terms of your relationships. But then there's always these standout people that comment over and over and over again on your posts, and those are your super fans. And no matter how busy you get, you've got to engage with them, and you've got to like get to know them. You've got to follow up with them when you don't see them for a while. Otherwise, you'll just lose your fans. And so I take that really seriously. And anybody who like actively supports me, I try to maintain a relationship with
Yeah.
them.
That's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately because I have seen a noticeable decrease in direct messages over the past few months that just kind of like hit me like, yeah, wait, what's going on here? And so I've been trying to make it a focus to like reach out to those people who were once raving fans who would message me all the time and try to and reconnect with them, like show them that I remember them and that I
Yeah,
actually care about them. So
yeah,
yeah,
it is really important.
it is. So Hala, this has been a a good, short, sweet podcast.
Yeah, I loved it.
And I will let you go. Youngandprofiting.com. People can find you there, and Young and Profiting on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Hala Taha on LinkedIn. H
Thank
A
you.
L A T A H A. Hala, I
Good job.
appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Of course, we're gonna hit end broadcast right here,
Bye.
and